Good morning. Today we will continue with our lecture on the 20th century literature. Previously we talked about the neoclassical and romantic traits. Today we will touch upon Victorian times and move on to traditional and experimental poetry. The Victorian age witnessed political, religious, economic and scientific changes, although the poetic flavor was that of the early 19th century. Still it developed a distinctive character of its own. The Victorians had to face the industrialization and its brutal realities. They had to cope up with this process of change and had to pave way for the new world. Darwin's discovery of the origin of species had the greatest impact on the age. The conception of man in relation to the universe with the idea of evolution filled the minds with doubt, and the faith in God was shaken. The realization that the existence of God cannot be proved or perceived pushed the Victorian society into a state of uncertainty. It ensued a conflict between religion and science. Earlier, nature was revered and admired, but in this period, it was treated in a realistic and less idealistic manner. Victorian poets and writers had less affinity towards art for art's sake and preferred literature as a medium to spread a moral message or to instruct. Literature of this time reflects the daily life and all its practical problems. It is also an idealistic age where emphasis is laid on truth, love, brotherhood, justice, and earnestness. The hardships, hard work and perseverance, love, chance and destiny win in the end. Virtuous soul would be rewarded and evildoers would be punished. It forms a link between the writers of the Romantic period and the very different literature of the 20th century. Coming back to traditional poetry, the poetry of the first half of this century is either traditional or experimental. To understand it simply, traditional poetry is divided into the Edwardian, the Georgian, and war poetry. Edwardian poetry, we'll talk about it. From 1901 to 10, these 10 years belong to Edward VII. During this time, the poets limited themselves to Victorian tradition and wrote on contemporary subject matter in language understood by common readers. But while trying sublime theme, the language was in keeping with the theme. Next is Georgian poetry. The poets discarded Victorian subject matter and mode of writing and tried to revive the romantic style. They wrote on simple themes in a simple way, especially about the aspects of nature, and they were well received and appreciated. Next comes the war poetry. The Great War had a lasting impact on the poets. The poets were either moved to write passionate, patriotic poems, or the poets reflected on the reality of war. The dark and gloomy picture of the war, the horror and the bloodbath, and about soldiers returning maimed and disabled for life was presented. Next is experimental poetry. As the name suggests, it is all about innovations and new ways of trying their hand in styles that suited them the best. The subject matter and form no longer appeared familiar, and the complexities of the time added stress on the readers. As the words and phrases and new rhythm were invented and presented to the readers. The Imagist movement. The Imagists searched for new mode of expression and preferred exact word to the merely flowery language. They chose their subject matter freely, and free verse suited their purpose. They were economic with their words and expression. They presented images of their ideas, and it left their readers confused as they could not understand. The possibilities for the writers in every aspect started exhausting, and this movement faded away. The metaphysical. The poets started reviving the style of metaphysical poets. They employed the same conceits and meters and half statements of the metaphysicals and modified it by using the imagery and language picked up from science and modern changes. The Surrealist movement. Surrealism regards the subconscious, that is, the state of dream or delirium, and present it to the readers as real by giving it a design and purpose. But soon it failed because of its queer subject matter. The Neo-Romanticism. The two romantic qualities, emotion and imagination, were used but differently. The subject matter was sought from the subconscious and not from the traditional source. The reader appreciated the familiar mode of writing but struggled with their imagination, which proved difficult for them to understand. The desire to enjoy reading was thwarted as they could no longer derive pleasure from it. We finish here with traditional and experimental poetry, and keeping all these things in mind, in the coming up lectures we will be focusing on poets and the writers. Have a nice day. Thank you.